Okay, it's 9 o'clock. We're gonna go ahead and start with Grand Rounds from one of our University of Minnesota residents, Dr. Resch, and she is going to be introduced by Dr. Waldo. Make sure your microphones are muted. I put in the chat a phone number. If you are having audio troubles, you can call the number and should be able to listen to the presentation. So Dr. Waldo, if you want to go ahead and start.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Brooke Waldo. I'm a psychiatrist on Team B here at the VA, and I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker this morning. This is Dr. Brooke Resch. She is a second-year psychiatry resident at the University of Minnesota. She came to us by way of Wisconsin, where she did her medical school training, undergraduate and medical school training at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. In medical school, she specialized in public health and rural medicine with interests in geriatric medicine and mental health. She's published several articles and letters to the editor regarding geriatric mental health, and also takes a special interest in cooking and food. Also in her personal time, she has had a YouTube channel. I think it's called Cooking with Dr. Brooke. And also does things like judging speech tournaments, very well-rounded individual. And she will be talking with us today about diet and depression, how food and impacts our mental health. So thanks, Brooke.
Yeah, thank you so much for that introduction. I probably shouldn't have included it in my my CV that I judge like high school public speaking tournaments because now I feel like the pressure's on. But it was a really kind introduction. Thank you to everybody for coming today. If anybody happens to be eating breakfast while we're doing our presentation, which is mostly going to talk about kind of healthy eating, don't feel bad about the bagel or the cappuccino. I can't see most of you, and I wouldn't judge anyway. I just finished up a donut on my way in this morning, so don't get stressed out about it. If anybody is not eating, I just wanted to let you know, heads up, because you might be hungry by the end of this presentation. Some of the slides and images may seem pretty appetizing, so the snackers among us probably had the right idea. I just also wanted to add that in preparing for this talk, it was kind of the experience of the more you learn about something, the more you realize you don't know. So this is by no means going to be like a fully all-inclusive talk, but just trying to highlight some of the nutritional information that kept coming up over and over and seemed more high yield for us to learn about and for us to be repeating to our patients. For disclosures, I have none. And then just kind of giving us an outline for what we'll be going over in the next hour-ish are some learning objectives. I'm going to talk about how I kind of chose this topic, and then I'll talk about some things we do know about diet and depression, different nutritional things that are associated with rates of depression and severity of depression, some of the caveats around that information, why it's hard to study this, why it's hard to implement it, and then kind of distill what we know, what we would like to know, and into a few nuggets that we can walk away with and also share with our patients. So for learning objectives, today we're going to be able to identify which nutrients do affect depression symptoms and depression incidence, describe the limitations on nutrition research, identify patients' barriers to healthy food and dietary change, understand the tenets of a Mediterranean diet, and then develop a little strategy for how we can counsel patients on dietary changes for depression. I wanted to talk briefly about how I came up with this topic. So as Dr. Waldo mentioned in her in the introduction, I am a really avid home cook. So during the day as a psychiatry resident, I spend a lot of brain power and energy trying to think deeply and thoughtfully about my patients, and many of whom suffer from depression and their disease and their symptoms. And then during non-working hours, I'm almost exclusively thinking about food. It bleeds into working hours a little bit too. I think a lot of folks go, what am I going to have for dinner, and kind of dread that question, coming up with an idea. And I just love thinking about that every day. I do have a really small hobby YouTube channel where I have cooking episodes and kind of healthy eating ideas. And so when I was trying to come up with what I wanted to talk about for my Grand Rounds, this seemed like a natural pairing. So I got to learn a lot about the field of nutritional psychiatry, which I had previously not realized was such an expansive area. And so that has been really interesting for me. Also, what a lot of people don't know about medical training is that if you go to med school, they teach you very, very little about nutrition. I remember having like a lecture about it, and but patients ask us truly all the time, what should I be eating? What lifestyle changes can I make? And what I can tell them is pretty much mostly from my own research or my own curiosity, things that I've learned, not really stuff that's in a med school curriculum. So really, and if there's any registered dietitians watching today, those are the folks that really get extensive training and education on this, and that's kind of lacking from our formal education as physicians. So I wanted to dive into it a little bit more today. So for this chunk, we'll talk about what we do know about different nutritional aspects and how they affect depression. A lot of us probably, or at least myself, have had the experience where we associate eating certain foods with affecting our feelings and emotions kind of minute to minute. So this, I like including this comic here. I'm on a low carb diet. Whenever I feel low, I eat carbs. When we talk about feelings versus mood, with patients, we'll often say feelings are kind of like the weather, right? I'm happy, I'm sad, I'm excited, I'm nervous about my presentation. And it can kind of change minute to minute, like the weather, it's sunny, it's raining. And then mood is kind of like the climate. So in general, is it moderate, temperate, a rainy area? And so most of this talk is going to go into how different dietary changes can affect our mood, but I did want to include a little bit of information about that minute to minute can food really affect our in the moment emotions. And there's interestingly a study done here at the University of Minnesota a couple of years ago where they surveyed folks and asked them to identify foods that they felt were like comfort foods for them. So if you had a bad day and you were going to eat something in order to feel better, what would that be? And they then exposed everybody to kind of distressing videos, some content that was like sad or frustrating, and had them rate their emotions after watching the videos. And then folks either got their comfort food, a neutral food, or no food, and then describe their emotions at the end of it. And the comfort food group did notice an improvement in their emotions after consuming the comfort food, but so did everybody else, the folks who had the neutral food or didn't have any food at all. So it was really suspected that it was actually just the passage of time that helped make those emotions less intense, and not really the comfort food itself. So despite the fact that we might feel like that bag of chips is really like in the moment therapeutic for us, it's maybe not the chips so much as it is just the passage of time. And then getting into how diet can affect our mood on not the minute to minute, but that like climate perspective, that is a person generally depressed, or are they above depression? What kinds of foods can help with that? So there is a lot of research looking at different types of fats and how they affect depression. I have on here some talking points about polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs. These are the omega-3s and the omega-6s that you might see on food labels or hear people talking about in kind of the food space. So what do these unsaturated fats, what are they doing? Biologically, they are present in cell membranes, really all cell membranes, but when I'm talking about depression, we're kind of specifically looking at the neuronal cell membranes, the neurons in our nervous system. So they can affect the fluidity and the permeability of those cell membranes and kind of how they're able to talk to each other. They also are really important for glial cells, which we might remember are the kind of helper cells, not exactly the neurons in our brain and nervous system, but all the other cells around it that are helping kind of preserve the environment that the neurons live in. And so these unsaturated fats kind of promote health in the central nervous system in that way. We have some large cross-sectional studies that show an inverse relationship between fish intake, which has a lot of these omega-3 PUFAs, and rates of depression. So that's when we ask a lot of people, how much fish do you eat? And then we ask them, do you have or have you ever had depression? We see that the folks who eat more fish, which are high in these PUFAs, have lower rates of depression. Which is not a super, which gives us a lot of data points, but it's not a super scientific way to look at things because we're not randomizing to different groups. It's tough to know what other confounding factors could be contributing to that. There have been some studies attempting to parse this out more and randomize fish oil supplementations or unsaturated fat diets to groups. And there is some evidence that for folks with severe depression, increasing the amount of these unsaturated fats can lower the severity of those symptoms, which is encouraging to see. And I have here some photos of examples of foods that would have these unsaturated fats in them, such as fish, like I've talked about extensively, vegetable oils, including olive oil, avocado oil, even canola oil, which sometimes gets a bad rap, has a lot of unsaturated fats, nuts and seeds. It's mostly any fats that are going to be liquid at room temperature, so like olive oil. Things that would be saturated fats or not fitting this PUFA category are typically solid at room temperature. So that's things like butter, bacon fat, coconut oil, solid at room temperature, very high in saturated fat, not these unsaturated fats that are more promoting of brain health. So coconut oil, often touted as a big health food, can certainly have some health benefits. I would say topically really good for your skin and hair, but maybe not so good at for our neurons and our nervous system. And then also wanted to talk about some micronutrients or vitamins and minerals that have been studied and looked at with regards to depression. So B12 and folate are both involved in monoamine synthesis, so making of serotonin. And similar to the fats, we have some cross-sectional studies that have mixed results with if they are preventative against depression. We do know that when folks with severe depression and are deficient in B12 or folate, if we augment that, that can help their the severity of their depression symptoms. And you'll see that kind of echoed again here where I talk about vitamin D. Vitamin D is involved in gene expression, and when one is deficient, that is associated with higher rates of depression and seasonal affective disorder. Again, supplementing across populations, not necessarily panned out to lower rates of depression. However, in folks who have depression and are deficient, supplementing with that vitamin D can really be helpful for their symptoms. Vitamin D is something we get from dairy products, certain mushrooms like cremini mushrooms, also fortified foods, so most like breakfast cereals are fortified with vitamin D, and also we get it from sunlight. So that's important to know because in Minnesota, in the month of February, our patients and ourselves are not getting a lot of sunlight, and just about everybody is probably vitamin D deficient, especially folks with more melanin in their skin with darker complexions have another barrier between them and the sun, and typically have even lower vitamin D levels. So if you have a patient in the winter months that's really not responding to their antidepressant or their psychotherapy, it might be worth figuring out, is there a vitamin D deficiency kind of superimposed on top of this? And so, yeah, I have pictured here some examples of the vitamin D being present in dairy products. Like I said, the mushrooms. Folate and B12 is almost exclusively in animal products. There are some types of algae that I believe, that do have B12 in it. So if you have vegan patients, they're probably not getting really any dietary B12 because they're not consuming animal products. So they really ought to be supplementing. Folate also really high in animal products, but can also be found in foods like edamame, lentils, leafy greens, all that good healthy stuff. And then this slide talks about a bit of the brain-gut connection. So this could be a whole Grand Rounds in and onto itself, and I would totally attend it to learn more. But essentially, there is a huge body of research going into how our minds and our gut are linked. We know embryologically, if we're calling back to some of our biology classes, that our nervous tissue and our GI tract come from the same cell lines when we all start as a couple little cells growing in utero. The nervous system and our gut come from the same cell line of the endoderm. And persisting into our adulthood, they're connected via the vagus nerve and other connections. So we do see that having a healthy gut, especially a healthy gut microbiome, is really important for mental health, and specifically the diversity of the gut microbiome. So not just how many of those good bacteria are present, but the variety between all of the good bacteria present. Ways that we can promote activity in this gut microbiome include increased fiber intake. Notably, this increases the activity of those bacteria, but doesn't actually increase the diversity very much. To increase that diversity, really want to be promoting probiotic foods. And then we can see a bigger variety in those good bacteria. So probiotic foods, often fermented foods. I have some pictures here. In the middle is something called, this is kombucha, and it looks like somebody making it at home. Kombucha, now pretty readily available at like grocery stores and cafeterias, as a fermented tea beverage. It's a bit of an acquired taste, I would say. The first time I drank it, I was kind of, I mean, it's fizzy, it's a little funky. It comes in different flavors, so you can get different sweetness levels and tastes. But it might be a bit of an acquired taste if you've never had it before. And this person that it appears is making it at home, you can see a jar of this tea with this kind of floaty thing in the middle, which is called a SCOBY, which stands for a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast. So that is really all the bacteria in the kombucha kind of eating up the sugars and making it fizzy, and that's really doing all the heavy lifting there. Other probiotic foods would be kefir, which is like a thinner yogurt liquid that you can drink or add to smoothies. Things like kimchi, which is a fermented Korean food. And these foods may seem a little intimidating or exotic to a lot of our, especially I would say elderly patients might be like, I'm not going to be drinking kombucha or eating kimchi anytime soon. But there's also really good probiotic foods that would seem more familiar to them. So I have here plain yogurt is a really great option for that probiotic benefit. And also things like sauerkraut, fermented foods, something a little more familiar to them, which is still getting that benefit. Another area looking at diet and depression is looking at how inflammation affects depression. Actually, Dr. Waldo, who introduced me, her Grand Rounds talk some time ago was kind of all about the connection between inflammation and depression. And for a long time and for a while, there's been research looking at, should everybody with depression just be on an anti-inflammatory, because we know that inflammatory markers are higher in folks with depression. And I think if we're asking that question, should people be on an anti-inflammatory medication, we should also be asking the question, should they be on an anti-inflammatory diet, and what does that actually mean? So what I came across when reading about this was a metric called the DII, or the Dietary Inflammatory Index, which is a biomarker validated index that kind of measures how much inflammation results from different food consumptions. I have some pictures here, and then I have a list coming up on the next slide of, in general, anti-inflammatory foods are going to be foods with antioxidants, so really dark, bright colors. I've got pomegranate here, berries, blueberries, turmeric also listed, very anti-inflammatory. And then the pro-inflammatory foods are going to be more processed foods, simple carbs. And I've got some numbers for you on the next slide. So this is listing the DII levels for various food types. So that turmeric, like I said, very anti-inflammatory, has this really negative number. Fiber, isoflavones, I was like, what is that? That's mostly present in beans and legumes. Beta carotene, tea, garlic, some of the omega-3 and omega-6 fats that we talked about earlier are also anti-inflammatory. Interestingly, a lot of people say like omega-3s are good, omega-6s are bad. They really both have benefit and can both be incorporated in a healthy diet. As you see here, the omega-3s are more anti-inflammatory, but neither would necessarily need to be like totally eliminated. And then things that are more pro-inflammatory, protein, iron, carbs, vitamin B12, which we talked about earlier as being something that we want to be supplementing or offering to folks if they're deficient, can be helping their mental health if they're not getting enough of it. Too much can also be pro-inflammatory. Cholesterol, trans fat, total fat, and saturated fat, which we talked about earlier being those solid fats, the butter, the coconut oil as a very pro-inflammatory fat. So those were some of the highlights as far as like what foods have been associated with affecting mental health. And I wanted to take just a little bit of time to talk about food as being more than just fuel and stuff that we put into our bodies. Eating meals is a really cultural and social activity that has its own benefits for on our mood and depression as well. So different foods and smells evoke different memories. Preparing foods can be a really mindful practice because you have to be really present for it. When we're going through a drive-through and picking up a burger and running errands and very busy, which is sometimes mandated by the constraints on our time, or we're kind of just going through the motions. And as opposed to when we take the time to really prepare food and eat with other people, we have to be more present for it. If you're chopping a carrot, you have to pay attention. You can't just go through the motions because you might cut yourself. And when we talk to patients about practicing mindfulness, that's really kind of the core piece of it, is paying attention to our senses, paying attention to our bodies and what we're experiencing in a non-judgmental way. And so I think the act of preparing food can be a great way to incorporate mindfulness into somebody's daily routine. And then the act of eating it with people, with loved ones, is also really important. Folks with depression report a lot of feelings of loneliness and isolation, and everybody's got to eat. So that can be an opportunity to kind of incorporate more socialization, more structure and routine by saying, okay, well, we're going to have dinner with this person at this time. We're going to prepare the food. We're going to wash the dishes, some behavioral activation. So it's not really just about what we're eating, but how we're eating it. And I interestingly found the American Occupational Therapy Association is now recommending that schools use round lunch tables instead of rectangular lunch tables because it incorporates that more social, engaged atmosphere for students on their lunch hours, which I thought was pretty interesting. So those are all healthy foods we can be eating, healthy ways that we can be eating. And then I wanted to go into just kind of naming some of the barriers to learning more about this and executing it. So there are a lot of limits on nutrition research. It's incredibly difficult to study nutrition because food and meals are such complicated, much more complicated than individual components that we might otherwise be studying in like a drug trial. So when we study fish versus fish oil, we get different outcomes. And it's really hard to kind of reduce foods to the sum of their parts. Vitamin A is not the same as a carrot, and even different preparations from foods can affect their nutritional value. So a raw carrot is different than a steamed carrot, which is different than a grilled carrot, which is different than a carrot with ranch dressing or served alongside chicken. And it can be really difficult to kind of pull apart what people are, those kind of subcomponents of food. And there's also a thought process widely popularized by Michael Pollan saying that we really shouldn't be trying to reduce food down to the sum of its parts. That's a little overly simplistic. So Michael Pollan has written a number of books, including The Omnivore's Dilemma, In Defense of Food, Cooked, talking about food. He's a pretty popular guy. He has a Netflix special. I've seen him on some late night talk shows, and he really preaches that food is really not just the sum of its parts. It's really kind of a little over reductive of us to try to be like, well, how much beta carotene are you getting, and not taking it into bigger pictures. So that's kind of one barrier, is just like trying to know about food and know what people are eating. Also, people are really inaccurate in their reporting. If anybody's ever tried to use like a diet log app like MyFitnessPal or something where you put in your food every day, even if you're attempting to write down everything you're eating accurately, that can be hard. Well, how big was this pizza? Like, it had olives on it, but then the other piece had more olives on it. And was it thick crust or thin crust? And what was in the marinara sauce? So it can, even if it's really difficult for participants to be accurately recording what they're eating. And then also, we just finished up January, and people may be able to relate to the idea of, even when folks have the best of intentions to change their diet and change what they eat, this is very difficult to execute in the real world. So when we start the year and we go, I'm gonna eat more fruits and vegetables this year, by the end of January, often that is not the case. So when we have folks sign up similarly for studies where we say, hey, you're going to eat more carrots and you're going to eat more apples, and you're not going to change your diet at all, nobody really changes their diet at all. It's really hard for even folks who are voluntarily signing up have a hard time kind of following through with this. So in addition to the barriers in actually conducting nutrition research, there's also barriers that patients have to food accessibility. So I can talk to patients about healthy eating, what they should or shouldn't be eating, but that is going to kind of fall on deaf ears if they don't have access to those foods. So I did think it was important in a talk about food to kind of call out food access as being a really big component of this. So food insecurity is defined as kind of that when folks have one or both, either financial or kind of geographic barriers to getting healthy food. And interestingly, I didn't realize this until preparing for this talk, food insufficiency in and of itself is a risk factor for developing depression, even more so than income, which I found fascinating. I think it was only beat out by housing insecurity as like a socioeconomic factor that leads into depression. So really if folks don't have access to healthy foods, then this can be especially hard to implement. People may be familiar with the feeling of, well, I want to eat healthier, but it's so darn expensive, and it can be. These are photos I took actually several years ago when I was working for a county health department in like rural Wisconsin. So this community didn't have a grocery store. You would have to get in a car and drive really far to go to like a real grocery store. They did have a convenience store with like a refrigerated section. So that's where I got these pictures from. The orange juice, pulp included, that's $5.59. Juice from concentrate, $4.15, and then a 2 liter, so the largest volume of liquid here, 2 liter serving of full sugar soda is $1.59. So as the food kind of goes down in nutritional value at this particular location, it's also going down in price. And that can be really hard to change. If you're on a fixed budget, then it's going to be especially hard to reach for the orange juice. Now, I'm not saying orange juice is like the most healthy thing, but with limited options and limited finances, this would be a really difficult decision to make. And this is also, like I said, a few years old. And inflation over the past year has, especially at the grocery store, has been really, really high. So these would likely be even more expensive today. And that other component of food insecurity is geographic limitations. So these maps were generated by the USDA like food desert locator. So it marks different census tracts and colors them different colors based on how accessible food is to folks in that area. It measures the median household income and then also the average distance to a grocery store in that census tract. And they use different metrics for counties considered rural versus urban. So I think in urban areas it's more than a half mile, or green is more than 1 mile from a grocery store. Orange is more than a half mile. And then in the rural settings, it's 10 miles because people are more spread out there. But so for a lot of our folks, just physically getting to a grocery store could be a barrier for them. And then the other big barrier is also health literacy. So folks have a hard time remembering what the doctor told them, especially if we're bombing them with lots of information. Actually, the more that we tell people at an appointment, the less they'll retain. So even though I might have all this great advice about how to change your diet, I'm not going to sit down with a patient and go, well, do you know about B12 and vitamin D and the difference between unsaturated and saturated fats, and start kind of overwhelming them with multiple pieces of information, because then it's less and less likely that any one piece of information is going to stick and that they would be able to follow through with it. So how do we take all of what we do know about diet and look at it through the lens of the barriers that patients have to said changes and try to affect change? And I think the best way to do that is to try to distill it down to one kind of take-home message, which I would offer would be the Mediterranean diet. So what is the Mediterranean diet? This is a diet pattern, not any kind of popularized around the Mediterranean, Italy, Spain, Greece, that really focuses on produce, whole grains, nuts and seeds, legumes, lean protein, and de-emphasizes some of those other foods you see at the top here, like red meat, processed sugars and things. No food is particularly banned on the Mediterranean diet. There's nothing that's like off limits. There's no like real counting involved where, oh, you have to keep your salt under this number and get your fiber up above this number. It's more of a framework for conceptualizing which foods are important. So this image was taken from a study where they were looking, like we were talking about earlier, about the gut microbiome, and they were demonstrating that the Mediterranean style diet does promote this gut microbiome. And I just really appreciated the image of kind of inverting our pyramid of what we should and shouldn't be eating. And despite the fact that diets can be really hard to study, we do actually have a lot of studies and some good data on the Mediterranean diet being good for depression. So the SUN trial, which is still ongoing, has been collecting surveys from folks since 1999, Spanish individuals, and basically sending out, I think it's 136 point questionnaire about how much of different food groups people are eating and what health outcomes they've been going through. At the time that they have over 20,000 people having filled out this survey up to this point. At the time that a lot of the data was analyzed, they had about 10,000. But it did show that folks who were more closely adhering to a Mediterranean diet had lower rates of depression. And the specific things that they asked folks about, and they would assign them a point value, was high consumption of unsaturated fat, moderate alcohol intake, high consumption of legumes, high consumption of cereals or breads, high fruits and nuts, high vegetables, low meat and meat products, moderate dairy, and high amounts of fish. So that pyramid from the previous table, really hitting a lot of those food groups that we talked about earlier as being good for depression is being kind of re-emphasized in the Mediterranean diet. Of course, there's flaws with sending out a bunch of surveys to people, asking them what they're eating, and having them report back to us. As we've talked about, that's not always super informative, even though we have a lot of participants. It's not a randomized controlled trial. The first randomized controlled trial that I found that looked at the Mediterranean diet and its effect on depression was the SMILES trial. So in this, they had 67 participants with diagnoses of depression. Most were on an antidepressant or in therapy or both. Some were not getting other treatment for their depression at the time of the trial, but most were receiving some sort of therapy. And to adjunct, they randomized these folks into two groups. One group received 7 sessions of group dietary counseling and dietary intervention, and the other group received 7 sessions of what they called social support or like friendly activities. The control group, I think they were doing like craft projects and kind of just some structured activity time as a group, whereas the diet group was getting counseling specifically on implementing a Mediterranean diet and talking over those kind of 9 points that folks look at in the Mediterranean diet. And then they saw how their depression symptoms changed over time. And as you can see, the diet group here on the left had a bigger decrease in their symptom severity than the non-diet group. Another important thing I want to make sure I make clear is that Mediterranean diet is not the same as Mediterranean food. So it's really emphasizing those principles of high amounts of fruits and veg, high amounts of complex carbs, healthy fats, and limiting meat, red meat intake especially. So that is not limited to gyros or chicken shawarma or Mediterranean food. It can really be applied to any cuisine. So I just wanted to include some examples here. This is a Vietnamese noodle salad. So lots of veggies, some shrimp on top. Vietnamese food also uses a lot of fish oil in it. So it's getting those healthy fats. A kind of a Mexican rice bowl, brown rice. This one, I believe, was just vegetarian. So watching the total meat consumption, some avocado on top, again with healthy fats. A Thai peanut noodle dish. So we're getting protein and healthy fats from peanuts and still adding in a bunch of veggies, and it's still going to taste delicious. And then even an American diet can be kind of Mediterraneanized. So instead of a burger, what about a salmon burger? And then topped with what I think looks like a delicious kind of herb yogurt spread. So we're getting a serving of fish that's lean protein. We're getting some probiotics in there, throw it on a whole wheat bun, and we're really eating foods that are promoting our physical and mental health, and it doesn't look so foreign. I also included a picture here of one that I like to make a lot. This is a Moroccan-inspired lemon and turmeric lentil soup, which my meat eater husband requests all the time. So it's vegetarian. It has a ton of lentils in it. It has that turmeric, which is super anti-inflammatory, and it's super, super delicious. And I wanted to include it also in case people are watching this presentation and like really gung-ho about going home and changing their diet and buying turmeric. It will stain your entire kitchen, so you want to be very cautious when cooking with it. But as I've learned, whitening toothpaste can get it out of most hard surfaces. So I wanted to throw that in there as a little bit of a heads up for anybody that might be taking on turmeric after this talk. So just going over, if a patient sits down with me and says, hey doc, what can I be doing other than taking my meds and going to therapy? Like what else can I be doing? And the nuggets I'm going to give them are going to be to follow a Mediterranean diet, and that's going to be focusing on veggies, lean protein, legumes, healthy fats. I'm going to also tell them that they should be preparing more of their own meals and cooking more as opportunities to practice mindfulness and socialization, eating with others. And I would tell them that this is in addition to the treatment that they're already getting. That's really how this has been studied as adjunctive onto folks already getting first line treatments. And so I wouldn't say it's a replacement for other treatment, but that it is, but when it's a way to enhance treatment and really offer that multimodal approach. And so these were the learning objectives at the beginning. I just wanted to make sure that we touched on all of them, some of the nutrients that affect depression, the limitations on the research, patient barriers, letting everybody know about the Mediterranean diet, and then how we're going to talk to patients about that. And so I wanted to leave the rest of the time for kind of, and I saw some chats popping up. I wasn't able to read the chats as they were coming in, but leave the rest of the time for questions, comments, discussion for everybody. And I can pull some from the chat now if. Oh, I was hoping that this presentation would be about how being on a diet makes one depressed, and so therefore we shouldn't diet. I guess not. Well, so interestingly, in that SMILE trial, they told folks it was not a restrictive diet at all. So they said, these are the tenets of the Mediterranean diet. Eat as much of it as you want. And the goal was not weight loss. They did measure people's weights, and there was no weight loss. But so folks did increase those food groups and did improve their mental health outcomes without being restrictive or losing weight or eating fewer calories. So I think that's another good thing to be telling folks is, and also to engage them and keep them motivated, is not, oh, you need to stop eating the donuts, but really, what can you add? What can we include that's going to promote health and not be punitive and finger waggy? I bottle my own kombucha at home, and I'm happy to share resources with people, including a SCOBY. I've debated starting my own kombucha, but I don't know that I have. It's supposed to be in a cold, dark room, I believe, and I don't know that I have any closet space. So maybe after my spring cleaning, I will have a space for some home kombucha. Oh, the recipe for the lentil soup, I'm assuming. I stole it off of Pinterest, and now I just kind of wing it, but maybe I will send it to Jay and it can be redistributed. Lots of comments on the soup. My diehard keto brain is struggling with this. Change is hard, knowledge good. And that is interesting. I know that a lot of like the blue zones are areas around the world where people have the longest life expectancy do have diets that are pretty high carb, high fat. And keto certainly has its own benefits, but I would imagine it'd be hard to adhere to a Mediterranean or a blue zone diet and also keto. So I think it would kind of depend on your goals. The DASH diet with how it holds up regards to depression. So I believe, so the DASH diet is kind of the diet recommended by the American Heart Association. My understanding is that its main emphasis is on watching sodium intake, and that you could really follow both simultaneously, both a Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet have a lot of very similar tenets and in decreasing saturated fat, and you would be able to pull it off. I didn't read anything specifically studying the DASH diet and depression. And yes, fresh turmeric is available in many grocery stores, especially if you are near an Asian grocery store. Fresh or powdered should be available. Do you think vegan yogurt is a good substitute for yogurt in terms of probiotics for those of us who are eating a vegan diet? There are vegan yogurts that do still have live active cultures, even though they're not chewing on a dairy product. So I think if you're doing a vegan yogurt, you would still want the live active cultures for the probiotic benefits, or be taking a probiotic supplement. Glad folks were enjoying the presentation. I'm just looking for other question marks in the chat, and I'm seeing some positive comments. But any other examples folks have had in working with patients talking about diet, or questions that people wanted to pose to the group here now?
Hi, this is Ryan. I don't know if you have any. I'm definitely not coming from a place of expertise, but my understanding about vitamin B12 of where animals such as cows and that are that are actually vegan get their B12 from is actually from soil, and that B12 is a bacteria that comes from soil. So the reason why someone who's a meat eater gets B12 from meat isn't because it actually comes from meat. It's because the animals are ingesting B12 from the soil that they eat. And so I'm my understanding, and I don't know if you have comments on this, but that there are, with factory farming and a lot of animals eating more and more processed foods, that there's actually a lot of animals coming from factory farming that are where the meat sources are also low in B12. And so B12 is something that there's a number, or at least some meat eaters can also be deficient in B12.
So yeah, anybody could be deficient in B12 if you, I am recalling, and I didn't read about this for this presentation, but I'm recalling a lecture from a while ago that your liver can actually store many years worth of B12. So
Interesting.
if you're adequately eating some now and then maybe go vegetarian for the month of January, or you give up meat for Lent, you're probably not going to become deficient in B12 overnight because there are pretty deep stores. And then, yeah, I don't recall. I'm not a biochemist. I'm not exactly sure where the B12 comes from, but uh, But yes, anybody could be deficient in B12. It's a lot easier for folks who are vegan to become deficient in B12 because it's primarily found in the animal products.
Okay.
I see a comment from Elizabeth who says, one of my favorite tools that I learned at a whole health workshop was the 5-minute nutrition makeover, which involves talking about a patient's current nutrition routine and collaboratively identifying a couple of places where some adaptive changes could be made. It may involve inclusion of more fruits or vegetables or water, or maybe eating more than one meal per day, which a lot of people are doing. And yeah, when I talk to folks I've not heard of this specific tool, but it sounds similar to setting like a SMART goal or setting goals that are very specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-based. So instead of saying, I'm just going to eat better in 2022, being like, I'm going to have a piece of fruit with breakfast at least twice a week, being very specific um, and making small changes at a time as opposed to bombing with one large, vague, nebulous dietary change. Nutritional yeast, yes, also an excellent natural source of B12. And nutritional yeast has like kind of a cheesy flavor. So that's really good sprinkled on like popped popcorn or pasta dishes. Would be a vegan source of B12 that is also really delicious.
Hi, I have a question for you.
Mhm.
So I was wondering if you did any digging on intermittent fasting or just calorie restriction in general, and if that has any implications for mood. I know it's really helped me. Maybe just through weight loss has helped make me feel better, and it's really changed my relationship with food. So just wondering if you had any thoughts about that. Now, I'm also the kombucha guy too, and it doesn't take up that much space, and it's really easy.
Oh, okay. Well, that's encouraging. I didn't read any studies about intermittent fasting and mood.
Okay,
So, but
I know it's kind of the opposite of what your presentation's on. I was just curious. Thank you. Oh, this is a great topic. Thank you.
right. And for folks who don't know, intermittent fasting is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is um, defining a certain window of eating and then remainder of fasting. So maybe eating 6 hours of the day and then fasting the next 18, mostly while you're sleeping, and typically doesn't say which foods to and not to eat, but when one can eat them. And so I'm glad that that's helpful. And a lot of folks do say that it helps them kind of portion control because, oh, it's 6 o'clock and so I'm done for the night, especially kind of like snackers and grazers. So it's another tool, but in my understanding of intermittent fasting, which I didn't read much about, but I'm kind of familiar with secondhand, is that you could really apply any diet to intermittent fasting. You would just add on those kind of time parameters around it. Calorie restriction in animals clearly prolongs lifespan, but maybe they're not as happy. Yeah, and I think that gets a little bit at the difference between feelings and mood, which is, I think a lot of us would say when we're not eating a lot of calories, we're in the moment, maybe not as happy. I'm not sure. I didn't look at any papers about calorie restriction and mood, but the ones that were looking at dietary changes were specifically saying, eat as much of this as you want. We're not looking at calories, but really what rather types of food.
I have a
Ideally,
question.
we can all live long and happily. Yep.
You touched on this a little bit about folks with, food insecurity or maybe folks who are living in poverty, and that these kinds of suggestions may be out of their financial means. I'm curious, like, what kinds of, if you know of any like resources to help folks get access to some of these more healthy foods or ways that you adapt sort of your conversation with folks who have limited means to, help their diets a bit, but, also in the context of their like financial resources.
Great question. So interestingly, when there was another study which I didn't reference in here where they looked at a Mediterranean diet in college students and how that affected mental health outcomes. And they found that actually it was cheaper for folks than the kind of control group, which they presumed was because people were like cooking at home more and buying groceries instead of like pre-prepared or takeout meals. That does add a huge level of like extra time commitment. I used to have to walk to the grocery store in college. I didn't have a car, and carrying beans and rice is very heavy, and it takes a lot longer than ordering takeout. So it's not just income and distance, but also like time, and it takes a pretty high level of, I would say, like food literacy to know like how to prepare cheap, healthy foods in a tasty way, and like intersecting all of that. That's kind of what I talk a lot about on my YouTube channel is like, what is a really cheap, healthy ingredient that we can make taste good? But as far as if patients are saying, I don't have access, then I would want that to be, instead of like, this is my 5-minute pitch, I would want that to be like, let's have a longer amount of time to talk about this and figure it out together, maybe with a registered dietitian or with social worker to figure out, to have more, because there's going to be more education that needs to go into that because they have more variables to juggle when they're coming up with what they're going to eat for dinner, as opposed to somebody who can like get their groceries delivered and get all the healthy foods in the world brought right to their door without any issues with that. If there's no other questions, then I think we can wrap up a few minutes early here too. Well, thank you so much to everybody for coming today and for thinking about approaching treating our patients from kind of this multimodal perspective. This is all in addition to the wonderful care and treatment that we're already giving, but what other directions can we look at folks' overall mental health and well-being, and do that kind of multimodal treatment and depression prevention with our patients, our veterans.